Welcome to Facts on the Ground, everybody. I'm Jesse Zerwell, and I'm joined by my co host, Misty Winston. Our guest today is Dr. Pierce Robinson. He is a friend of the show, and he works with the Organization for Propaganda Studies, as well as the Working Group on Syria, Propaganda, and Media. He is also a political scientist and well positioned to talk about what we are going to discuss today, which is propaganda in and of itself. So, welcome back to the show, Piers.
Hi, good to be with you both.
So, let's start with the very basics of propaganda. And there perhaps hasn't been a more timely period in history to talk about propaganda, to analyze it, to understand it. So when we're talking about propaganda, at least in its current incarnation, what exactly are we talking about? Because we hear the word bandied about a lot, but when
Yeah,
we home in on it, what is propaganda, at least in the contemporary sense?
yeah. I mean, the easiest way of understanding what propaganda is to think of it as an organized approach to shaping people's beliefs and opinions and actions. Okay, and it's a process which is essentially manipulative. That's certainly the way I define it. And it's manipulative in the sense that people are not getting to believe something or to act in a particular way through free will. They're either being deceived or they're being incentivized or possibly coerced in order to think something or to act in a particular way. So propaganda is an organized approach to manipulating people, getting them to do something in a way that really their free will is not involved. And it's, in a sense, an important characteristic of it is that it's organized. We're talking about carefully thought out, well organized activities. So, and this is how I define it. It's how I prefer to define and operationalize it. So it is, propaganda is different from somebody, for example, on a street corner talking about politics, or somebody expressing their opinion. Sort of, you might say that what they're saying has propagandistic elements to it, or that's fake, or that's a lie or a deception. But it's, when you talk about propaganda, you're talking about something which is much more organized than that. People who've got resources, knowledge, and so on, and they go about the process of trying to move people, to mobilize bias, as a sort of term that Schnatscheider uses in relation to this, to get people to act and behave in particular ways. And again, this idea that it's manipulative. Now, not all academics will go. Some academics say that all kinds of persuasion is propaganda. And I think that's an unfortunate way of using the term, because people understand what propaganda means. It means some kind of manipulation that's going on. And if you call all persuasion propaganda, then it loses the ability to think about ways of going about persuading people in an honest way, in a democratic way, in a way where you're not trying to deceive somebody. So I think it's good to keep a distinction there, although people should be aware that some people sort of like to say, well, all persuasion is propaganda and so on. I think it's worth keeping that distinction.
Yes.
And so that's what propaganda is. And just finally, in terms of the West, I mean, propaganda in the early parts of the 20th century was spoken and written about by theorists such as Walter Lippmann, Laswell, and so on. And it was seen as a necessary part of democracy. And it was this idea that, well, you can't have complete democracy, that the masses need to be led. And it was seen as a necessary part of democracy. But I think by the mid-20th century, in part it had got a bad name because of what happened in the First and the Second World War. People recognized it as manipulation. And so, as Edward Bernays, the founding father of public relations, famously said, propaganda came to be understood, it got a bad name. And so we rebranded, we came up with a new name, public relations. And therein was born public relations. And over time, the sort of euphemism industry has developed, especially in the West, and these terms such as strategic communication or political communication, psychological operations, all public diplomacy, all of these terms are commonly used to describe activities which actually sort of in the first part of the 20th century would have been called propaganda. And the point of introducing that is to make the point that actually propaganda is all around in our contemporary democracies. We just call it something else. And that, you know, a lot of the activities that governments and big corporations and other powerful actors engage in, although it's not always necessarily propaganda, it often ends up being manipulative and it often ends up being propaganda. So it's very extensive. It runs throughout the West in a very deep way. And again, this is one of the problems we have is people say propaganda, they think of either the world wars or they think of authoritarian political systems. Propaganda happens over there. It's the Chinese and the Russians do propaganda and we do, well, the truth. And that's a profoundly misleading and self-deceptive analysis of what's going on. Propaganda is deeply embedded throughout Western liberal democratic institutions.
Yes.
Tricky to make that argument a few years ago, but in the last 2 years, there's been a rapid awakening on the part of many academics and lots of scientists who had previously been completely unaware of all of these issues, just to how much manipulation there is. And of course, with COVID-19, we've seen this on a huge level, maybe the biggest level we've ever seen in Western democracies. So it's a key part of how our systems operate, and it's a key part of how power operates. And it's one of the reasons why when you understand the levels of propaganda, you begin to understand quite how poorly functioning our democracies are. Because obviously, if you have very high levels of propaganda, you don't really have people acting through free will. They don't have a good understanding of issues because there's a lot of deception. And so you're very long way away from meaningful public sphere stroke democratic debate when you've got very high levels of propaganda. But that's what we've got, and one of the reasons why we are where we are now, in very bad shape is the only way I can describe it in terms of our political systems.
Yes, I think you could actually make the argument, and my friend Steve says this all the time, that the United States is the most propagandized country on earth. You know, it is, and I think it's because so many people do not see it as something that you would find in a democratic country, that it is, you know, a North Korea issue, it's a Russia issue. I think that so many people are unwilling to see what's happening around them, you know, in their own country. And I think that you mentioned in the past 2 years, I think it's kind of been even longer than that. I think really since Iraq. There's been this kind of snowball of people kind of realizing the extent to which we are propagandized and lied to in this country, which is great to see on one hand. On the other hand, it's, you know, pretty terrifying that we are at that point, because it is, they're very, very, very good at it. It's not as overt as it is in other authoritarian countries. It's very covert. And as you said, it's really all around you. It's everything from marketing, like modern day marketing is, you know, just propaganda. It's just, you know, something that's created to make you feel a certain way so that you will buy a certain product. And it's pervasive. It's all around us every single day.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the figures to mind, but I know some of my colleagues who work on propaganda have, you know, pointed out that, you know, it's one of the biggest industries in the West. And actually, when you just start to think about it, when you think about, I couldn't say this when I worked for a university, but as I don't work in a university now, you know, when you look at a university and you look at its PR literature and the kind of sort of very glossy, happy view that it presents of the university and so on. When you look at organizations like that, and as well as big business and governments, you start to see sort of how much of the environment we're in is, you know, they have PR departments, they have PR experts who are working for them. And this runs through, you know, all organizations. And then you start to get a sense of, you know, there's a lot of money being spent on this. A lot of, you know, intelligent thinking is going into it. Behavioral scientists, of course, and that's one of the lessons we have learned from COVID-19. You know, Laura Dodsworth's, but you picked this up early on, that SPI-B, the behavioral psychologists, were being drawn upon by the government to work out how they could engage in the propaganda on COVID-19. So you've got a lot of very deep thinking going on there on how to manipulate people. And that's one of the issues. I mean, I think some people have raised this issue in the UK about behavioral psychologists and whether they've been breaching essentially academic ethical guidelines because they've been helping governments to manipulate. Now, the behavioral scientists have put their hands up and said, "Oh, no, we're just trying to do good." But in my experience of behavioral psychologists in my time at universities, these people shouldn't really be anywhere near public communication. But that's just a personal opinion. But the point being is, you've got a lot of investment of time and thinking into these activities and money and resources. So to come to your point, yes, I think it is reasonable to say, well, the West is perhaps the best at propaganda. It has a long history. It's deeply embedded throughout our institutions and throughout our culture, as it were. And we've got the skills, the knowledge, and the resources. So it would be interesting, and I would like somebody to do it at some point, to compare, sort of have some kind of index of propaganda and to look at, say, China and Russia and then the West, and just have some measures in there of resources and time. And it'd be interesting to see what the results were. And I won't prejudge that, because this is just a question I'm throwing out there. But it would not surprise me if the West would come up very high on the index of organized propaganda, and just with the amount of time and investment into it.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I wanted to ask you about too, because it's used against us in many different ways. It's not any one specific thing. It is used to keep the people divided amongst themselves. It's used to, create racial divisions. It's used to manufacture consent for wars. It's used to, get people to vote a certain way, or it is really, it's more of a manufacturing of reality than anything. And as it is so pervasive all around us, is it possible for us in the current system to even combat the propaganda as it is? Because I know that there's a fantastic interview that Noam Chomsky, who has his faults, don't come for me. I know Noam Chomsky is not, great. But he did a fantastic interview with a reporter at one point where the reporter was asking him, are you saying that Yes. Are you saying that I self-censor? And he said, no, I think you believe everything that you're saying. I just know that if you didn't believe it, you wouldn't be sitting here. And he speaks about the kind
Andrew Marr didn't quite understand the point.
No, he didn't.
Making, I think. He just
really
sat there
didn't.
looking confused.
He did. But he then spoke also about the system, that it is really kind of a system of where if you think outside the box, if you are too controversial, if you are too aggressive or combative or an adversarial towards power, then you will just be pushed out. You won't make it to that position. So I mean, is it even something that we're able to reform, say?
And just to add on to that, I think that speaks to the point, or the fact that propaganda has become much more subtle over time as it's progressed. Whereas in the beginning, let's say in Stalinist USSR, it was very overt. You had the cult of personality, for example, and that's still what most people think of when they think of propaganda. They think of pictures of the great leader staring down at them from every wall on every street corner, but it's become much more subtle and much more refined over time. And I think that's something we have to remember too, which can make one a bit paranoid, because you do start to see propaganda everywhere, especially nowadays. But I think it's probably safe to say that that's one of the end games, if not the end game, of propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, it's certainly subtle and very refined techniques of manipulation. Sort of, the favorite term in recent years has been this nudging idea, hasn't it? Just nudging people and so on. That's where the behavioral psychologists, some of whom are good and do good work. I wouldn't want to say that it's to be wholly negative. It's more to do with the way they've been employed with COVID-19, where they really have come in and just supported governments propagandizing over COVID-19. But yeah, these subtle techniques, and you're right, and because just as you said, because they're subtle, and then the point made before, how on earth do you combat this or as an individual? I mean, there are two aspects to the point made there. One is that how do people within organizations deal with this, and then second, how do publics deal with the fact that they're living in a very propagandized environment? I mean, the reality is that any individual going into a big organization, organizations, power structures, and they have hierarchies. Those organizations have interests. And I think for those professionals who go into, whether it's academia or into journalism, a recognition that to get on in that organization, that they need to do some things and not other things. It's a very slippery slope. And I think the reality is that a lot of our institutions are corrupted in that way, in the sense that professionals go in, they learn the culture, they learn the interests of the organization, they know what side their bread is buttered on, they want to get promoted, and they end up, as it were, being caught up, pushing that organization's agenda. Of course, a very big problem in the media, because the media is meant to be there and objective. Actually, a very big problem in academia as well, because academia isn't supposed to be about supporting your university to become the top university in the world and maintaining its public relations profile. It should be about using your space in academia to think critically. So that sort of way in which people within organizations get sort of co-opted into the power structure is a very big problem in media and academia. Quite difficult to fight off, yes. I think, well, I used to be somewhat kind and say, well, people just need to navigate through the system. They just need to do the best they can. I'm given what's happened with COVID-19, I think that professionals, whether they're journalists or academics, scientists, a medical scientist, or even a political scientist, should be looking at themselves in the mirror and saying, is what I'm doing, am I actually sort of not being true to my profession? And if the answer is you're not being true to your profession and the circumstances are preventing you from doing that, you've got to be brave and stand up and take the consequences on that. And a few years I would have been cautious about that, but now we're in a situation where people are just getting fired anyway, as we know, fired and pushed out of jobs, nursing, medicine, academia, because they are standing up against what's happening with the COVID-19 agenda. So it's going to hit you at some point. So really, I think I would say to all my colleagues in academia, if you have realized what is going on with COVID-19 and how serious this is, then you really need to just stop worrying about your job, because you're not going to have a meaningful job if we move into the system that they're trying to lay out for us. So professionals who are important in society should be sticking to what they know in their hearts is the right thing to do, and to their professional. And that requires bravery and courage, and it also requires being willing to stand up and be removed from the system. But there's plenty of academics doing that at the moment, and plenty of scientists doing that. If I was to be transported a few years back, I would have said things like, well, no, you need to stand up to that, or you need to speak the truth about that, because if you don't, things will just get worse and worse, and things are much, much worse now in relation to that. So, it's difficult for professionals in institutions, but, we all know the difference between right and wrong, and people can guard against just doing what is expected of them, even though they know it's not quite right. People need to, sort of defend their professional autonomy and stand up for what's right. So, that would be my response to that side of the question of how do people within institutions deal with pressures to say certain things or to act in certain ways. I think for the public at large, I mean, there is a first step in this process. It's good to understand questions surrounding media bias, and this is in a sense just an education point. I mean, you brought in Chomsky there, but Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent, and the vast swathe of political communication research which tells you and reminds you and demonstrates empirically that the mainstream media is not fully independent of political and economic power. So you don't go to it for the truth. You go to it in the knowledge that you're going to get information which is skewed. Doesn't mean you shouldn't necessarily listen to it, although should be to But if you understand that, then that gives you the ability to think more critically. And exactly the same thing goes for understanding propaganda. And that's one of the reasons why I was so keen to study propaganda. And I set up the Organization for Propaganda Studies with other like-minded researchers, was that we really, both academics, but also the public, just need to understand better the amount of propaganda. Because as soon as you do, you insulate yourself from to an extent at least, from propaganda. It allows you to think more critically, and it allows you to think for yourself. So just by, in a way, just going through those kind of processes of self-learning or reading around and understanding the nature of the mainstream media, understanding the nature of propaganda in Western democracies, goes a long way to you being more able to defend yourself. And a lot of people arrive with that understanding because they've gone and taken a course at university, or they've read around. Other people, sort of instinctively know that. One of the most naive groups in society are, in fact, the professional classes who've been brought up through the education system. And often they're the most propagandized and most naively believing of the mainstream media or sort of authoritative academic opinion. And part of that reason is maybe because they are caught up in that power structure, and they don't want to knock it, because that power structure gives them their sort of legitimacy and authority in society. Otherwise, I think that because the propaganda runs deep, I think there's a lot of, in a sense, indoctrination as you go through the education system, and we're being careful with what I say. I mean, my experience going through studying political science and then international politics and then doing a PhD and then going into academia and building a name, I was quite conscious at various points of sort of, we're being disciplined here. We're being nudged, pushed in directions to study this and not study that. And it's not because anyone is necessarily intentionally doing that, but it's the culture which is formed there. And I think that sort of has a powerful effect in terms of directing where people go and so on, and how they understand what they can say. So, but anyway, but the point is, people can understand, people can learn about these things, and this gives them the basic skills. And then I think, there's this whole kind of media literacy idea, this, thinking critically about information you receive. Who is the source? Where is it coming from? Can I look at for alternative pieces of information or alternative sources and weigh them together? So, a simple example is, in war and conflict, well, okay, let's listen to what the government is saying, but let's listen to what other governments are saying, and let's listen to what these organizations are saying. And I do think, if people are open-minded about thinking about information, different sources, people have quite a lot of ability to think critically. I do believe in sort of basic intelligence of most people in society, that they can work things out, that they are able to judge what's reliable and what's unreliable. But they just need to keep open-minded, and they also need critically to have this kind of confidence in their own ability, this kind of faith in yourself that you can sort of form judgments. And there is an underlying thing there about this question of gaslighting and this way in which people sort of don't have this confidence anymore. And so why is that? Is that part of the education system, that people have as it were, lost this confidence in their own intelligence? And I'm not sure, there's various explanations, but there's certainly a sense in which people should be much more confident of their own abilities and should learn these skills of media literacy or critical thinking, in order to, when they approach news or when they listen to the government, they're simply not blindly following what they're told. So I think that's important. And I think the only final general thing I'd add to this thing of how you fight against it is that people need to recognize, and at the broadest level, that democracies only work when you have people who are thinking and engaging. That, it might be that for the last 30 years, we've had a very apathetic population, especially the professional classes, enjoying their extended holidays and second homes and thinking all is great in the world. And that has, led to a situation where people aren't engaging and challenging enough. Democracy, a healthy democracy, should be, You should be rigorously examining, testing your governments. You don't just leave it up to the politicians. People should be engaged. And I think recognizing that democracy doesn't just run itself, and having a kind of a political culture which is all about people thinking, engaging, and so on is critical. And I know a few years back people would say, well, people aren't interested in politics, they want to watch the football, they want to do, and so on. Well, maybe, but if you do that, then you run the risk of losing democracy. Democracy only works when people are engaging and are thinking and are challenging, not believing what they're told, but scrutinizing their governments. And so on. So I think all of those things are important to keep in mind, and which can be done to try and fight propaganda. And that not everyone, propaganda works on a lot of people, but it's often the professional classes or the elite groups it is most effective on. I mean, I've lost count of the numbers of times that I talk about global war on terror with fellow academics, and they only understand it as one, in the mainstream way. And then you get into a cab and you're talking to the cab driver who you suddenly realize knows quite a lot more than most of your academic colleagues about aspects of the global war on terror. And then you suddenly realize, well, a lot of people who aren't, a lot of people can figure it out for themselves. So it's not just propaganda doesn't work on everybody, and it's not totalizing. There's always, scope, and there's always a lot of people who recognize and can see through a lot of it. So it's not a hopeless task, for sure.
Yeah.
So I wanted to drill down into specific eras of propaganda, if you will, and one of those being an era that's ongoing, the global war on terror, and an era you've focused a lot of your work on. And I think one in which we've seen almost endless, relentless propaganda pushed on us for the benefit of unending war. And I can think of so many examples, from sending more troops to the Middle East a surge, then it was a plus up. Then you had in 2006 the war between Israel and Hezbollah, and Condoleezza Rice saying that we're witnessing the birth pangs of a new Middle East as Lebanese civilians were being slaughtered. And on. The examples, I think, are endless. But if we can drill down into that specific era and analyze it a little bit and parse it, what would you have to say about it? Because I think for my generation and Misty's and my generation, that was really the first time we saw propaganda come to the fore and become almost a totalizing force. So I'm wondering what you have to say about that, given all your work.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting hearing you talking about that phase. I mean, because we've had the last 20 years of global war on terror, and for me, I was at university in my 20s during the 90s, and that was the Cold War had come to an end, and Francis Fukuyama, it's the end of history. Everything's okay. We've got democracy and capitalism, and everything's fine. And you had that sort of period of stability. But then, of course, prior to that, I remember the Cold War, or at least, the 80s part of the Cold War, when I was sort of conscious of these things. And, that was, you had propaganda, but you had this kind of, set geopolitical bipolar standoff. You had conflicts throughout the world, but these were at the margins, hence why it's called the Cold War for the West, because we weren't actually fighting. But there was, that was totalizing the Cold War, in the sense that, I mean, and certainly from what I can remember, the earliest points in the 70s, in that sort of the fear of nuclear conflict was something which ran through a lot of society, but it wasn't always there. It wasn't always present. People were aware of the Cold War situation, of course, it was total for people in Vietnam and in Afghanistan, the sites where the conflict was occurring. But for people in the West, it was somewhat distant, and there were cold, it was very intense, Cuban Missile Crisis and so on. But there was still, I mean, maybe my memory of it, there's a separation between everyday life and then.
Uh-oh. Technology.
YouTube.
Oh, maybe you're back. Are you back? There
You
you're back.
disappeared for a few minutes there, so I stopped
Yeah,
speaking.
You froze up. You froze up a little bit. Yeah.
Should I? What point did I? Was I talking about the Cold War?
Yeah, you were talking about the Cold War and how, in a sense, it was totalizing, but at the same time,
some feeling of separation. Yeah,
right.
And there is, so to come to your question. I mean, when you get to global war on terror, I mean, in a way, it's a kind of a similar pattern. When it comes to war and conflict, you get lots of propaganda and you get lots of deception, and that's why, you know, a lot of propaganda studies focus on conflict and war. And so, you know, historically, you have looking at Gulf War I, Falklands War, Vietnam War, studies on propaganda, and of course, First and Second World War. But with the global war on terror, this was a war, but it was, you know, it started to seep through and become, I think, in a way, even more totalizing on people's psyche, because, you know, you had the event of 9/11, which is obviously controversial, which we can talk about. But then you had these rolling regime change wars flowing out of that. And these were, as you said, that point you made about the forever war, that the war on terror became this, you know, because the terror threat was difficult to define, and you can't have a war on terror, as it were, doesn't quite make sense. It became this never-ending enemy, and it became this justification both for, you know, civil liberty restrictions at home, the Patriot Act, bulk surveillance, changes to sort of laws and so on surrounding civil rights in terms of detainment of people, bulk surveillance. And so, yeah, it ushered in that kind of societal level changes, while all the while being used to justify conflicts, Afghanistan to begin with, then Iraq, then this kind of period of quiet until the so-called Arab Spring, and then you had Libya and Syria kicking off, which can understood to be connected, not necessarily indirectly, but through a route, but back to 9/11 and the regime change wars which were put in place then. And of course, those conflicts are still going on. You know, this is all still going on 20 years on. And so you did have this kind of, it became totalizing in the sense that the propaganda associated with the global war on terror was leading to these substantial changes within our own societies. You know, Patriot Act, bulk data surveillance, bulk data collection, civil liberty changes, and so on. And then this kind of permanent state of war abroad. And I think, you know, that in a way was kind of set the scene for what we've had since COVID-19, which maybe come to later. But it's certainly, you know, I think you see this, I mean, almost this kind of way in which all parts of society and thinking are then getting caught up in this kind of meta-narrative which is created. And again, so maybe parallels with the Cold War for sure, but you know, not also differences in that, you know, I think changes such as when they start the bulk data collection, which we know because of Snowden that they were doing sort of right away after 9/11. You know, if you have a situation where governments are collecting, or intelligence agencies are collecting and check, or potentially can look at all of your digital communication, you democracy kind of like has stopped at that point. Because, you know, the autonomy of people, and then when people, if they become aware that there's that surveillance going on, then people will self-censor. But your ability to question and challenge power is then ultimately undermined. If your government's doing something which is really bad and really wrong, and you've found out about it and you want to do something about it, government can find out that you know that and then can put a stop to you. You know, this is a sharp, dramatic change, and of course, this is what, you know, a lot of the critical scholars pointed out from the beginning of the war on terror, that these changes, this state of emergency being created on the back of the alleged Al-Qaeda threat, was something which was really taking our democracy rapidly downhill. I mean, there is kind of a broader historical look you can take at you can look at Eisenhower and his warning about the military-industrial complex, which was pretty black and white, to be quite honest, for a president stepping down. Kennedy came in. We know what happened to Kennedy, and we know what he was trying to do about the same problems which Eisenhower had identified about the military-industrial complex. And of course, the point there was that democratic control was being lost to this kind of deep state, permanent state entities. And there's no sign that problem was resolved. Kennedy was removed from the picture, and many other major leaders in the 60s and 70s, obviously Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and then you get to the point of 9/11. You've then got a further tightening of control over the American population, and then sort of really that filters through to most of the kind of liberal democratic states follow the lead of the US. But you had a real clamping down on essentially sort of key elements of democracy. And that's even then you get to COVID-19, obviously, as into an even worse territory. But that was, I think, that kind of thing that Eisenhower warned about. You can see a sharp, it gets rapidly worse after 9/11. All these arguments about continuity of government and so on. And people look into. And I think that's what we've been living for the past 20 years. And I think for people, for you, having lived or sort of been, as it were, become with political awareness during that point in time, and for me as somebody who was an academic and studying, and then we've gone a shift into this, that it has been, before COVID-19 came along, it was in a way getting very bizarre. I mean, I remember I used to. I used to go out to NATO and lecture to senior officers coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq in about 2000, 2008. And even then I was thinking, this is strange. They're all caught in this machine, which is going. Everyone knows that Iraq was a deception and it was wrong, but they're caught in the machine, and they're trying to do what they think is the best job they could possibly do. But it sort of almost as though the train everyone was on a train and they couldn't get off it. And of course, what's happened with global war on terror is that it then sort of transformed into what we've had in Libya, and then of course what we've had in Syria. We've had 10 years of covert operations and support of groups trying to overthrow the Syrian government for 10 years. And I think sort of by 2015, I was looking at all of this, going, wow, we really have moved into this permanent state of war and conflict, which is now sort of off our radars. People are upset about Iraq. It's all going on. It's carrying on. There's no stopping it. And there doesn't even seem to be the institutional memory within the establishment and within, say, NATO about sort of the history of this. They're all in this machine. So I think in terms of my personal experience, that ties in with that feeling that sort of the global war on terror, we've been immersed into this conflict, which has changed our civil rights and made life traveling through airport security extremely difficult, and so on, as we all know. But it has, the tentacles of power have reached more deeply into us and every level over the last 20 years. And that's all before we get to COVID-19. So looking back on it, it seems a kind of a downhill slope from Eisenhower's warning, but rapidly worse after 9/11, and then to a point where, we seem to be caught on this train and caught in these narratives, these stories which have been told, and that's a big one with the global war on terror and the issues of 9/11 and Al-Qaeda, obviously, and it has been transforming our lives, not for the better.
Yes. And I think it's important too that it's not just the stories that are told, it's also what they don't tell you. Jesse and I have spoken about this many times with Danny Scherzen. Since Vietnam, we don't really see the reality of these forever wars that we're waging. We don't, I mean, they'll show you the bombs taking off and Brian Williams will get super excited about how beautiful it is, but we don't ever see where those bombs land anymore. It's a very conscious effort on their part to shield people from the devastation of war. And I think that that's a very important part of the propaganda system, is that not only are they feeding you certain narratives, but they're also making sure to prevent you from hearing or seeing certain narratives, which I think is, something that a lot of people maybe don't pick up on because it's, kind of the absence of. But I think that it's, that's what makes all of this so very nefarious, because it is so very coordinated. It is so very,
and of course, this is Julian Assange. This is what he did. He revealed part of what was happening in terms of what was happening to civilians, and you're absolutely right. I mean, this. I mean, in conversations I've had with colleagues and siblings over, what do you actually think is happening in Iraq and Afghanistan? I mean, can you think for a second about what is going on the ground? We're talking about real people, real families being destroyed, and there's kind of a glazing over of the eyes. But it is, as you say, it's this thing is pushed into the zone of silence. People don't see it, they don't understand it, and it allows the thing to carry on. And
Julian Assange actually, I brought some examples of propaganda in case we wanted to go through some of them, but I'll share this one. Oh wait, no, I can't. Oh, my computer's being dumb. Anyways, it was it was the one they released that in France they had like a propaganda system that they were going to go by and this is very interesting because in the United States we very much heard the same narrative, that raising the prospect of Taliban reversing, quote, progress on girls' education could become, quote, a rallying point for France's largely secular public and, quote, give voters a reason to support a good and necessary cause despite casualties. And Julian Assange revealed that that was their plan in order to manufacture consent in France to continue the war in Afghanistan, that we have to do it for the women and the children. And that was their way of manipulating their public into supporting this war.
Yeah, and in that sense, I think propaganda has evolved to the point where it doesn't even have to make logical sense anymore for it to have an influence on people. And I'm thinking particularly of the so-called assassination of bin Laden. And when that happened or didn't happen, because he was buried at sea, we're told, and who knows. But as soon as Obama came out, within, I believe it was something like 20 minutes of receiving the news that supposedly bin Laden had been assassinated, he came out, made his little speech, really provided little to no explanation. And what was genius in a way about that was that he capitalized on all this pent up emotion, 10 years of pent up emotion that people had stemming from 9/11, compounded by the global war on terror up until that point. And people didn't question, some people did, to be fair, but by and large, people didn't question the narrative that was trotted out. Well, why was he in Pakistan? Why was he able to live there comfortably? Who was enabling that? And how was the SEAL team, how was SEAL Team 6 able to land in his compound, helicopters and all? Why was he buried at sea? How come we never saw pictures of the body, etc.? People were so conditioned, which I know is a word that's used a lot, but they were so conditioned at that point after 10 years of this war on terror propaganda campaign that it really just went to the heart of their emotions, and they could throw out all logic and buy into this narrative that was being peddled to them. And to this day, minus the work of some people like Seymour Hersh, for example, That remains the official narrative. Now, if you read Seymour Hersh's work, you get a much different, and I think a much more honest picture, or one that's much more close to the truth. But I think that's another powerful aspect of propaganda, if you will, is that now it doesn't even have to make sense. It just has to penetrate people's emotions in a really profound way for it to work.
Yeah, I mean, you do get the sense that sort of getting people to suspend their critical faculties. I mean, part of it's through shock, right? That, you know, 9/11 is a good example of the event of 9/11. So you have buildings, planes going into buildings, you have buildings collapsing. You know, this is a powerful, shocking thing, and so then when that happens, people, you know, will very quickly look to authority figures to explain, because you're terrified, you're shocked, and so on, and you're looking for leadership. So I think part of it is the kind of scale of things which have been occurring, which have left people just kind of dazed and confused, and then not thinking straight. I do think at the same time it's been sort of backed, though, by this kind of powerful propaganda machine, right? That sort of, you know, you're pulling out all the stops with the mainstream media. You're pulling out now all the stops over the internet and with social media and through what are various technologies they have in order to try and influence people. So you're having to do two things, big dramatic things, and COVID-19 is a good example. You know, global virus. You know, people thinking this is the plague is about to hit. So you have that shocking sort of claim being made, and then you have all the propaganda mechanisms being drawn upon, and then all of our institutions, which are effectively being corrupted, being brought in. And when you bring all of that together, you can carry people a long way. And a lot of people will, suspend their critical faculty. They won't think about what they're seeing. They won't, for example, think, as many engineers have thought, as I know, have spoken about the 9/11, the buildings coming down, of, yes, that doesn't quite make sense. And, building 7, WTC 7, of course, collapsing 5 hours later, doesn't make any sense at all in relation to what we're seeing.
Which to me is one of the ultimate examples of gaslighting, wherein you can see the video of a controlled demolition happening right before your eyes, and you have the assumed
official
masters,
narrative.
telling you that that's not what
it was
you're
a fire.
seeing.
It was just a fire. Come on, a whole building got brought down because it kind of caught on fire.
But for a lot of people, I mean, they got WTC 7 out of the news footage, I understand, fairly quickly, so you didn't get to see it. Now, look, I wasn't aware of WTC 7 until 2015 or 16. No idea about it. So I think that, sure, a lot of people, this gaslighting idea, but then there were still a lot of people who looked at it and went, no, that doesn't make sense. That's why you have architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, and a whole host of other professional organizations. There are pilots, there are firefighters who've formed organizations over the years saying that these things do not make sense. So, it doesn't, it's not with everybody, but then it's with a big chunk of the population. But they still need the fact that you've got a corrupted, highly dysfunctional academia, media, and political establishment, which allows this to happen. Because, and this is going with rose-tinted glasses, but you could go back to Vietnam, and I know that media and US did not perform the role that many people think it did, but there was a point, at least with Vietnam, when people like Walter Cronkite, had enough authority and kind of institutional backing to start calling out what was going on in that war, or elements of it at least. There's at least something going on. And so I think there was sort of, some degree of integrity. I don't want to stretch that too far in parts of the US mainstream media at that point. But at the point in 9/11, it's almost completely gone, and across most Western democracies. And I think this is what we now see in brutally clear terms with COVID-19, is that these institutions are pretty much dead in the water. They're not in any way autonomous. There is no robustness within them. So the opportunity for that journalist to go out, a Walter Cronkite type character to go out and then, challenge what is going on is completely gone. So I do think that, yes, I mean, that there's gaslighting of people, but a lot of people do realize what's going on, and increasing numbers have realized that something is very badly wrong. And it was the case after 9/11 as well. You had large sections of the population not buying it, and they've stayed, and that number has grown. And so they've been sort of immune from the gaslighting, but the whole thing has been carried, I think, because look, I mean, our institutions are clearly corrupt, and I can say that with confidence, having worked in academia for 20 years, having worked with politicians over issues such as the OPCW issue, and also worked with mainstream journalists in various settings at various times, and also sort of been sort of talking with people in the military at various points in my career. The institutions aren't working. Parliaments aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. The mainstream media, they're genuinely broken.
Yes.
And now, unfortunately, we've reached a point where it's now very, very clear that's their would kind of unfortunately predict if your institutions, which are there to protect and to blow whistles, have failed, then something terrible is going to happen. Powerful actors will exploit that situation and take control over the population. And guess what? Exactly what we're living through now, which is why, as we've spoken,
which
elsewhere,
we should maybe jump into some of the COVID-19 stuff, because I don't want to keep you for too long. We could do a whole series on this.
Yeah,
but
we probably will continue. COVID-19 is not going away.
No, that's
I
true.
don't mean the virus. I mean,
but I wanted to ask you, because it seems like the powers that be, whatever you want to call them, empire, the establishment, whatever, they're getting much more desperate in their attempts to control the narrative. We now have Twitter, where they're going to start banning people if you even question, or if you even say that vaccinated people can spread COVID, which is just a fact. And so you're now going to lose your account if you just talk about facts. So it seems like they're getting more desperate, which I think honestly will backfire against them even more than it already has, because I think people, as you said, more and more people are starting to recognize the ridiculousness of all of this. And the fact that the fact that you're not even allowed to have these conversations should be a red flag to everybody. In a democratic society, you should be able to question everything. You should be able to have conversations about all of these things, especially with something as serious and as far reaching as COVID-19. This is something that impacts literally everybody on a daily basis. And so you should be able to ask questions and have these conversations and seek answers and all of those things. And so it seems like they're getting much more desperate in their attempt to clamp down on complete narrative control. I mean, we see what they're doing to Julian Assange. That very much has everything to do with it. They're attempting, it's not just about silencing him, it's about sending a message to everybody else. And he's just kind of the head on the stake. Like, he's the warning.
He was ostensibly forcefully injected with the so-called vaccine.
Yes, according to his father. Yes.
Yeah, on Consortium News.
And then had too many strokes. So there's that.
Right,
but yeah, it seems like they are getting more desperate. So do you think that is because to me that seems promising? And Julian Assange has also said as much. He said that censorship, I'm going to butcher the quote, but censorship is a sign of fear, that they're afraid. And so, I mean, is that something that you see as a positive, that they are seemingly getting more desperate?
Well, yeah. They're certainly getting more extreme, and they're having to become more extreme because the need to keep control over populations has been increasing for some time. I mean, this gets to the heart of what's going on at the moment, and of course there are various arguments out there about exactly what is going on, but we do know that there's clearly a network of powerful economic actors and political actors, whether it's the World Economic Forum or Big Pharma, Big Tech, who, as Kees van der Pijl describes in his new book, this is kind of a class block has formed. They're fighting to hold on to power. There is certainly an element throughout the West, and Kennedy talks a little bit about this, but also Kees van der Pijl and others, that Western governments are using COVID-19 in order to implement new changes, restrictions on liberties through vaccine passports, digital ID, and so on, as a way of keeping control on the restless population as they deal with what can only be described as an entirely broken finance system, as people have been speaking about. So they are trying to keep control. They're becoming more and more extreme. The levels of propaganda are off the chart in that sense. It is a sign of weakness in a way, yes. But I think that's about as much as you can say. I think, as others are pointing out, that we are at an absolutely pivotal point, quite literally in history, in the largest sense, but more specifically for the history of the West and Western democracies. And we are at a point where there is now a battle between elite groups who are trying to hold on to power, both for a combination of selfish reasons, financial, sort of holding on to their wealth, but also there's ideological components to it. This is a bit of the kind of the ruling elite. We know what's best. We want to transform the world. We want to take it into a new, a new world, a new environment, the fourth industrial revolution, all of these ideas which you see floating around these various actors, that these forces are working very hard to push these transformations through and to hold populations down. And the level of protests we're seeing, the level of organization globally there is now, pushing back against this. You can see this resistance, but we're in the middle of the fight. We're in the middle of this struggle. For people who haven't realized this yet, it's good to, start to get up to speed very quickly, because it is really happening right now, this struggle. And I think that, the opportunity here is that the authorities and the powers, and it's not just national level, we're talking about global level actors, whether it's big tech, big pharma, World Economic Forum, or any of these organizations linked to them, what they're driving for is what they're struggling to try and maintain at this point is not clear what will happen. It could be these plans, which we can see now very clearly, the plan to get everybody injected every 6 months, to get everybody onto a digital grid, which will move to one rapidly, potentially to a social credit style system. All of those changes which they're trying to force through, that might happen. And if that happens, we're all in a lot of trouble, and we don't have democracy anymore, and we don't have freedom anymore. Or they could lose, in which case I think the wheels might come completely off the existing structure, and then we're going to have to try and be rebuilding what we've got. But the people who've been driving this will then be considerably exposed. And people talk about Nuremberg 2 and all these kind of arguments, and that's a very, very possible scenario. But at the moment, we just don't know what's going to happen. This is where we're at. These two things are coming up against each other. Increasingly coercive authorities driving this political economic restructuring, resistance, not patchy. There's a lot of resistance, but not necessarily coordinated, pushing back against that. And we don't know where it will go. So I don't know whether the powers that be are sitting there thinking, we're gonna roll these people over, no problem, or whether they're scared and anxious. It varies across those elements. But sitting back and looking objectively at this now, we are in the middle of a fight. Nails Harriet described it. This is World War III, and this is now between the populations and their governments in the West and these other higher level actors. And I think that is an accurate description. I mean, Vanessa Beeley talks about it in terms of the predator class, and they've spent the whole of the war on terror. Other populations have been subject to the predator class. Now they've turned on the Western populations, but that's what we've got. And I don't know what the outcome will be. I think there's reason to be optimistic. It's definitely a time where people need to act. They need to get up and to find out what's going on, to get involved, and to resist what's happening. But we're in the middle of it, so we'll have to see where it goes. But certainly, I think maybe pick up on your point. I do think you're right that the power structures are revealed in a way that they've never been revealed before. And so the opportunity to change that and to end the kind of corruption which has seeped through Western institutions, there is an opportunity to end that. If we don't succeed, then we're in a very different territory where we don't have democracy anymore. I don't know quite what the political classes who are chattering about this are thinking, but if you're living in a society where your ability to interface with that society and engage in that society is dependent upon you taking an injection of a drug, supplied by a commercial company like Pfizer, that's not freedom, that's not democracy.
No.
And some people haven't quite got that through their head of them, but that's not freedom.
Right.
In fact, it's an extraordinary level of control over people that you are basically forced into having an injection that you don't want to have. It's the stuff of nightmares, and it's the stuff of both bad and good Hollywood movies.
And what we're seeing now with this COVID-19 era is that propaganda is much like a virus in that it's able to mutate to fit the environment and perpetuate itself. So, one example of this, and I don't know if you've heard of this, Pierce, but I saw this on UK Column that the propaganda architects are moving away from nudging to what they call boosting now, and which is cruelly ironic given the booster campaigns that are being forced upon people. But this idea of boosting is, instead of playing upon negativity, it's playing upon positivity and trying to boost people in a certain direction, make them feel good about the direction they're going in, like they're empowering themselves by making decisions.
There's a lot of virtue signaling kind of propaganda that's happening right now where, do what's right for your communities. And, there's all of these ads where, like, there was one recently where I saw, children's ability to participate in athletics was going to be predicated upon whether or not they were vaccinated. And so there's like this whole commercial where they made where it's all these kids playing sports and having fun with their friends. And, oh, you don't want to miss out on this, do you? And it's all this kind of virtue signaling where you want to feel good about yourself. You want to feel like you're doing the right thing. You want to feel like you're helping other people and being a reasonable member of society. And it's very effective. It really is.
Yeah, kids in Canada now in some places have to prove their vaccination status before they can play ice hockey, which I don't know what being
there's a school
injected,
somewhere.
I don't know what being injected has to do with playing ice hockey.
Nothing. But there's a school somewhere where the kids have to go up to the front of the classroom at the beginning of every day and state whether or not they're vaccinated or unvaccinated. If you're vaccinated, you're applauded. Yeah, if you're vaccinated, you're applauded. If you're unvaccinated, you have to explain yourself.
Yeah,
these are kids.
Yeah, I mean, and it's all made all the more horrific. I agree that this is one of where propaganda is just seeping through all elements of society and so on. It's the kind of stuff you see in wartime propaganda. You saw it in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. But all of this is going on when you have scientists such as Peter McCulloch, Robert Malone, and the list is it's not endless, but there's lots of scientists who are just saying this is completely wrong. And actually, a lot of even scientists who haven't spoken up much about COVID-19 are saying, well, why are we injecting children? This doesn't make any sense. I mean, it really is as stark as that. As you say, people are being told that to be a valuable, good person, you should be injecting yourself and you should be injecting your children, whilst at the same time over here, you have eminently credible scientists saying this is absolutely the wrong thing to do. Something's got to break on this at some point, right?
Yeah, but it seems we've gotten to a point where people just accept almost everything now. There's a piece that just came out in Science magazine. I'm paraphrasing, but the headline is something to the effect of Australia is developing a novel COVID-19 vaccine that contains HIV protein fragments. So they've halted the development of it, I believe, because they were finding that it contains HIV protein fragments. And people look at that now. A lot of people look at a story like that now and go, well, that's just part of the development process. Or they see people being hauled away in military vehicles to injection camps. Oh, well, such is the way the world works now. And
we got to stop the spread.
in that sense, I think propaganda during the COVID-19 era has really reached a zenith of sorts, as far as maximizing its, not just ability to convince populations on a large scale, but also to um, change their perception of reality in really profound ways, to normalize things that even a few years ago we would look at with horror and disgust.
Yeah, very true. That's very true. And that's why I often say that it's like a manufacturing of reality. It's not just that they're able to get you to vote against your own interests, or, they're literally getting you to think against your own interests, to take in, to internalize these things, and, make them part of your own personal psyche. And a lot of the times people think that it's like they decide, like they're making these choices. I mean, people don't feel like they're being manipulated. We lost him. Maybe he'll jump back in.
Surprise,
Technology.
surprise. When we
I know.
start talking about
I know. Always happens here. Yes, he's
the
back.
magic virus.
I know. Hello, welcome back.
Funny
Oh,
that should happen when we start talking about the magic virus.
I know, right?
Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, so my point in saying all that was
Mm.
just that I think propaganda has, I don't know if we want to say it's reached a new level or an unprecedented iteration, but
They've definitely
it's
honed their
certainly
skills.
it's certainly at a point where people are able to rationalize doing things that would have
Yeah.
caused shock and horror in them a mere 2 years ago, which certainly has echoes of what we saw in Nazi Germany, in Stalin's Soviet Union, etc. So
Absolutely. I mean, to me, at this point, do we reach the point where the lies and deception, whether about the virus and the injections, or about the bigger thing, that this is not really about a virus, it's about the political and economic restructuring which they're trying to get underway, that lie and then the reality and also people's experience of that becomes just too great and the bubble bursts. And there are obviously some signs that more people are beginning to become aware, whether it's because of the booster, that it's not just one injection, it's several. Then this kind of pressure on your children. Most parents will think carefully about, well, should I really be injecting my children with this, and so on. And there's lots of information out there. At what point does this become the thing collapses in on itself? And I think that's a possibility at the moment. I'm not saying it will happen, but there is a stark difference. Just anecdotally, I've noticed on LinkedIn, which is, the kind of professional social media network, lots of people, lots of traffic in the last 2 or 3, 4 weeks of professionals starting to talk about this. And LinkedIn is pretty brutal. They remove stuff pretty quickly, but there's still lots circulating. I've had like sort of 300-400 people wanting to link with me, or 300, I think, in the last few weeks. Which is, it means that they're linked with you, and then that is publicly visible kind of thing. So, that at least amongst those professionals who are normally on LinkedIn because they want to find work, there seems to be, in my experience, a lot more people starting to wake up to what's going on, making sense that this doesn't make sense as a response to a respiratory virus, not 2 years in. And this whole thing about repeated injections on everybody, quite aside from issues that we see in the media, whether it's athletes collapsing and all those issues, I think that people, it could come off the rails. But also this might be why they're getting so nasty. This is why authorities are going to, well, we're going to inject you, and then if you don't take it, we'll fine you, and if you don't pay the fine, we'll put you in jail, or we'll just cut you off to a sort of a quarantine center. That's a sign of the authorities having to resort to, well, how can you describe it? I mean,
yeah,
fining and jailing somebody because they don't take an injection. I mean, or taking them off to a quarantine camp.
they're overplaying their hand a bit on some of these things, like firing people, especially what I think a big one was when they started firing nurses and doctors who were refusing to get injected, because those were the people who for 18 months they were on the quote unquote front lines of this thing, with not even proper PPE. They didn't even have like proper, like we just threw them out there like, here, you have to go deal with this thing. We're not going to give you the adequate protections. You're going to have to work, ridiculous hours. And it's and then as soon as we have this injection, if you refuse to take it, you lose your job. Like that, to me, I think that sparked a lot of people to start thinking about this on, in a bigger way, because, and then the children thing, you start coming for people's kids and they're going to start questioning it. They're going to.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think a lot of some of this, they're really kind of overplaying the quarantine centers. I think that's something that has made people like some ears perk up. Like, wait, they're doing what now?
Yeah.
They're doing what? What are they doing?
Because there is also a possibility that they're over egging some of this, because actually the underlying thing is to keep the attention away from the economy and to keep the attention away from the political restructuring that, and it's difficult to know for sure, but an element of this might be, or it could be both at the same time. They're trying to keep our attention away from the finance crisis. And then at the same time, they want to get as much control over us as possible. So we'll push these people as far as we possibly can. What can we get them to sign up to? And even if we can't get them to sign all the way up, we'll at least have a lot more control over them than we had before.
Yeah.
It's like,
again. But he's right. I mean, you're right though. Like the CARES Act, when the CARES Act happened, there should have been a massive outrage about the CARES Act in this country. It was a monumental transfer of wealth to the top 1% in the middle of like a economic crisis. And none of it got covered. Like very, very few people even talked about it. I think Jimmy Dore was somebody who talked about it on a regular basis. There were a couple like independent channels, but obviously there was no talk of it on CNN about what was actually the Build Back Better crap is the same thing. It's just another transfer of power and money to the top 1%. And they're continuing to do those things while distracting us with literally anything that they can distract us with. COVID is like a very, convenient way to distract people and to scare people, because when you're scared, you don't think properly. You don't, it's very difficult to maintain a cool head. And so that's why fear is such an effective tool for manipulation, and why it's used in so much propaganda is because it is, once you're scared, it's very difficult to keep your wits about you and to think rationally.
And there's a parallel to be drawn with 9/11 too, as far as criticizing this COVID-19 hysteria, because when you still to this day take a critical look at 9/11 and the events therein, a lot of people will say, how can you even go there? 3,000 people were murdered, which is true. And today, if you try to take a critical angle on, I think to anybody who's really looking at what's happening, is just pure derangement, this whole COVID-19 narrative and agenda. A lot of people jump back and say, well, how can you say that? People are dying. Almost 800,000 people have died in the US. And, you can then try to explain to them that there are lots of dodgy things going on here with regard to PCR tests and cases and what constitutes dying from COVID-19. Is COVID-19 actually a virus, or is it a lab-created chimera? And so there's, again, a parallel to be drawn there that plays a lot upon people's fear of death and manipulates that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult process with a lot of people, because, as you say, you got to take them through the propaganda is so deep. There's so many layers to it. You need to sort of start with, well, okay, those are the figures, but then the collateral damage is much greater. And then, I mean, I don't talk extensively about the science side because I'm not a scientist and it's not my area of expertise. But my understanding from people who do look closely to science, I mean, overall mortality, these things, is absolutely not clear that COVID-19 is the problem that it's being presented as. And it's certainly the case that, quite even before the whole injection thing starts coming in and questions over what that's actually doing to people, The numbers of people you've got who are dying through collateral damage, just as my understanding, it exceeds massively the numbers who can be attributed to the virus itself. And then you've got all those measurement problems. And in a way, this should have been obvious from the start, right? But of course, this is why it's not about a virus, makes sense now. But from the very start, it makes absolutely no sense to focus everything around dealing with one particular condition, lock down society, disrupt normal routine medical attention. Obviously, that doesn't make any sense because you're just fighting one thing and everything else is being left. So it's obvious that it was not a sensible thing. It was overturning decades of public health policy. You don't quarantine whole populations. You quarantine the sick and so on. But of course, as we know, because it's not really about that. This is it's a structural, deep event which is being used to change in a profound way our economies and our political structures. And so the scientific responses aren't rational, and they're not meant to be rational. But again, how long they can keep this thing going, especially with the boosters and the injections and more doctors speaking up, and there are more and more doctors speaking up. How they can really keep this going, we'll have to see. It's a fight we can win, but yeah, so guys, I only say the same thing I said before. We're in the middle of it.
Really in the middle of it. You know what
yeah,
I mean?
we are.
We really are. We really are.
Keep speaking out any way we can, and like
yes.
CJ Hopkins says, keep creating friction against the official narrative.
Yes. My position is always that they're lying, and then I go from there. And I think that's a pretty healthy manner. I'm curious though, if you, to both of you, I have some personal experience where I'm noticing some people who maybe bought into it early on. Maybe they've gotten themselves injected, maybe they've gotten themselves boosted, and maybe they're kind of questioning it, but they feel duped, and so they don't want to admit it, maybe to themselves or certainly out loud. Do you think that there's some of that? Do you think that there are some people who just haven't been able to come to terms with the fact that they've been duped?
Yeah, I'll let Piers answer first.
Well, yeah, I'm sure probably that's an element of it. But yeah, I'm sure there are probably many reasons why people sort of beginning to become aware. I think some people are probably becoming aware and are just terrified of what it means and are thinking, maybe I'll just keep my head down and see what comes out of this.
Yeah, I think that's certainly happening. And I'll just add to what Piers said by saying that the way to combat that is to try as much as you can to talk gently to those people with facts and not talk down to them and not
mock them for having been duped.
Right. Yeah. Because we're all being manipulated on some level, even us three who are pretty aware of what's going on here. There's still manipulation, I think, that's taking place, whether we're aware of it or not.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it happens, and then we look back and say, oh, okay, I was thinking this way, 10 minutes ago about that, but I think this makes more sense. They're presenting it this way for this reason. But yeah, I think that's happening to a lot of people, and it's going to happen to more as these injection campaigns are continually rolled out. But people like us and just anybody who's resisting what's going on, I think it behooves us to talk to those people, as I said, gently and with facts, and in a sense nudge them to come to start thinking with reason and to tolerate or learn how to deal with the fear that comes along with thinking reasonably about what's happening. Because once you realize what's happening, it is a very frightening thing. And
yes,
we have to in a sense nurture those people and
stand in solidarity, I think, with them.
And I don't mean in some kind of like grand re-education, like we know what's best sense.
No.
As equals, as equal human beings in solidarity with them.
Yeah, and yeah, I agree entirely, and very important to communicate to people that there are lots of people. That I mean, I was just this World Council for Health has just formed and got 20 plus organizations, doctors, scientists, and they understand some of the politics. You know, there are lots and lots of people globally who are organized. They're not difficult to find on the web who are resisting this, let alone the people out on the streets. So you know, sort of people might feel very alone when they start to realize what's going on, or they might move in circles where you know all of their colleagues or family don't understand what's going on. But there's actually a lot of people out there. This is an issue where there are thousands upon thousands of people going out onto the streets. There is lively debate on social media, and then there are these organizations, and global level organizations, where people can find out what is happening and then join and support. You know, decide what they want to support. I mean, in the UK, I know that they've had Us for Them has been pushing for campaigning for get masks off kids in schools for a long time. But then there's the Together movement, the movement of movements. There's a whole variety of groups which are organizing, and they represent communities as any social movement does. So people, you know, it might be scary, but there's lots of other people out there, and they're not too difficult to find. It just requires people to open their eyes and to be willing to really, yeah, well, to look. But you know, people have got to look, because what's happening is bad. It is worse, you know.
Yeah.
That we're looking at the end of democracy and the loss of pretty much meaningful human autonomy, and so it's time to wake up, and find out what's going on. But I agree, you know, solidarity and empathy for people,
Solidarity and understanding, and I think a lot of
yeah,
people too are aware of what's happening and they consciously know, but I think they're afraid to speak up because you do get ostracized in certain circles. You do. I mean, I've lost a multitude of friends over this, and that's I mean, that's an unfortunate fact. So I think a lot of people maybe like a silent partner, like they know what's happening, they're very aware, but they're just afraid to speak up. They're just afraid to be vocal about you know, what they're thinking. And hopefully the more and more we see people speaking out, the more doctors, the more scientists that come out, the more people, the more conversations like this, the more people that are in the streets. I think more and more people are going to become more comfortable with speaking out. So
yeah, I think so. We can win this, definitely.
yeah. I agree. I don't like to be, I'm usually very cynical. But I think that we really can't. I think that over specifically the past 6 months, seeing the vast amounts of people in the streets around the globe has been very heartening to me. Like that's been really something that I was unsure was going to happen. I would still like to see more of it in the United States. There isn't a ton of it here. But the fact that it is happening around the globe is really encouraging. So, you know, I still have hope. I still have hope that we can do this. If I didn't, I wouldn't do this. Like I wouldn't even bother. But yeah, I think that we can still win this thing.
The thing is, resistance, even if they implement all this, resistance won't stop. Yeah, it'll carry on. It'll just be an awful lot harder and take longer. So this will come to an end at some point. Yeah. But when, we'll have to see. But the thing is, at the moment, this can be stopped in its tracks potentially, and we don't want to get to a point where we're all having to go into kind of guerrilla resistance kind of mode where it's underground.
Yes.
We want to try and stop it now, and that means getting more people to engage as much as you can. I don't want to spoil Christmas for everybody, but and people need to take their breaks from this. But yeah, this is a really urgent, critical time, no doubt about it. So
but I think you bring up an important point there as we wrap, that yes, we need to very much home in on what's happening and resist it, but not at the expense of our human relationships, right?
Yeah.
And because I think part of the campaign they're waging is to get us entirely fixated. Divide us and entirely fixated on their agenda to the detriment of other relationships we have, thereby even more creating estrangement in society between people, even between people and their families or their loved ones. So, um, just speaking personally, it's hard for me sometimes to take a step back from all of this. I feel guilty, like I have to keep going. There's always more to do, but we have to be able to step
Step
back from
away.
it and be in the real world with the people we love, because
got to
that's
pace ourselves. Pace ourselves. But
yeah.
then, I agree, and also, stay true to what we're fighting for, which is, our families, our lives, our friendships, and so on.
And that act
absolutely.
is really an act of resistance.
Yeah.
It's something that Stella said about when they decided to have children. Stella and Julian Assange decided to have children. That that act of building a family was an act of defiance. It was an act of resistance. And I think that there's a lot to be said for that. I think that maintaining your humanity and maintaining your your relationships and all of that. I think it's incredibly important. If you lose that, then what's the fight for? So I mean, that's a really great point, Jesse. That's a really great point. So, I mean, we could continue this conversation, and we should have these.
Well, talking of family, my family is calling me for dinner.
Yeah.
So,
well, yes. We would definitely love to have you back on to continue this. I mean, propaganda is something that fascinates me on a personal, like just me personally. It's what I do in my activism. So I would love to have you back on to continue this conversation. Do you just want to tell everybody quickly where they can find you on Twitter, where they can find all of your work and all of that, so people can keep up?
Well, I'm on Twitter at Piers Robinson 1. I have a WordPress site. Organization Propaganda Studies has a website, working group. I mean, you can see links on my Twitter handle to the various working groups that I'm part of. So
I dropped them in the chat too for everybody earlier on. I'm going to drop them again. But and I'll also put them in the description of the show notes and all that stuff. So thank you, Piers, for coming back on.
It's great talking to you.
We appreciate you. Yeah. And thanks everybody in the chat for checking us out. And we will talk to you guys soon. Bye, everybody.